The man waited until the camp grew quiet before he slipped past the outer rows of tents, a bundle of worn leather straps hanging at his side and a dull ache running through his hands from yesterday's work. The wilderness around the Israelites spread out in low, rocky hills and scrub, the kind of landscape that made every tree feel precious. The sun sat high, unbothered by the day's command to rest. Wind pushed dust along the ground and rattled the dry branches of the few shrubs that managed to survive in the hard soil. From inside the camp, voices still drifted through the air. Families sharing their Sabbath meal, parents telling their children again why this day mattered, why there was to be no work. Out beyond the tents, the man found only the sounds of his own breathing and the scrape of his sandals on stone. He knew what the law said. Everyone did by now. The Sabbath command had been repeated, taught, drilled into the people as they moved through the wilderness. 6 days for labor. 1 day set apart. No fire started. No gathering. No carrying burdens. It was the rhythm that marked them as different from the nations they had passed. But hunger and habit are stubborn. The man's family was short on fuel, and the desert nights could turn bitter. So he walked farther from the camp, away from the eyes of elders and neighbors, telling himself it was just a few sticks, just enough for a small fire when the sun went down. He reached a dry wash where scrub trees clung to the banks. Their fallen branches lay scattered in tangles, stripped of leaves, light enough to carry. He bent to pick up the first stick, then another, listening to each crack as it broke away. As he worked, the bundle at his side grew heavier. He felt the old rhythm return, the simple routine of gathering, sorting, binding, thoughtless motions he had done 100 times before. That familiarity made it easy to push aside the words he had heard the day before when Moses had reminded the people of the commandments. There were thousands of them out here. Would anyone even know? Someone did. A small group of men from the camp had also left the tents that afternoon, walking the perimeter, talking quietly about the new laws given at Sinai and the weight of what it meant to live under them. When they saw a lone figure moving among the scrub, they watched for a moment, then moved closer. At first, it was hard to tell what he was doing. Then they saw the bundle of wood. They saw him bending, lifting, tying the pieces together. It was not an accident. It was work. On the Sabbath. They called out to him. He straightened, startled, the bundle of sticks half tied in his hands. The men approached, their conversation from moments before suddenly feeling sharper, more urgent. Confrontation in a camp this tense was never simple. They asked him what he was doing. He answered with nothing that could excuse it. There were no words about ignorance, no claim he had mistaken the day. He was gathering wood. They knew it. He knew it. They seized him and led him back toward the camp. By the time they reached the tents, word had begun to spread. People stepped aside as the group passed, eyes tracking the man and the bundle he no longer carried. He was brought before Moses, before Aaron, and before the assembled leaders of Israel. The men who had found him explained what they had seen, the deliberate gathering of sticks on the day when work had been forbidden. Moses listened, but he did not hand down a punishment immediately. The law had named the command, but it had not spelled out what should happen to someone who broke it in this way. The man was placed under guard while Moses sought an answer. In the camp, the air grew heavy with whispers. Some people wondered why such a small act mattered. Others remembered the warnings that had come with the covenant, that obedience was not optional, that rebellion spread like infection if left unchecked. Parents held their children closer and repeated the stories of Egypt, of the plagues, of the sea that had opened and then swallowed their pursuers. This was the God who had brought them out. This was the God whose words Moses had carried down from the mountain in stone. Moses went before the Lord to ask what should be done. The answer left no room for debate. The man who had gathered sticks on the Sabbath was to be put to death, not in secret, not by a small group charged with the task. The entire congregation was to stone him outside the camp. The breaking of the commandment was not treated as a private failing. It was presented as an offense that threatened the whole people. When the order was announced, the camp reacted with a mix of fear, disbelief, and grim acceptance. The man was brought out from where he had been held and led beyond the perimeter of the tents, into the open ground where they had buried other dead. Men, women, and older children followed, forming a ring around the place where he was made to stand. Stones lay scattered across the dry earth, the same kind that had been piled into markers when they reached new sites on their journey. Some who stood there knew the man personally. They had eaten with him, worked beside him, watched his children play with theirs. Now they watched him face the consequence of a choice that, on any other day, would have passed without comment. The command had been clear. The warning had been repeated. Today, the gap between what felt small and what was declared serious had disappeared. At Moses' direction, the people took up stones. There was no formal speech, no plea recorded from the man who stood in the center. The law had spoken. Obedience now meant acting on it. The first stones came from those closest, then from others as the circle tightened. The blows fell until the body in the center no longer moved. Dust rose in small clouds where the stones struck earth. When it was over, the people turned back toward the camp in silence, the image fixed in their minds. What followed was not just the burial of a man, but the reinforcement of a boundary. In the verses around the story, the law of the Sabbath sat beside instructions for offerings and commands about intentional and unintentional sins. The people were told to wear tassels on the corners of their garments, a constant reminder of the commandments they were to obey. Every time they looked down, they would see a visible sign meant to keep them from following their own desires instead of what had been commanded from above. For those who had stood in that circle, the memory of the stoning became its own kind of reminder. The wilderness journey was no longer only about surviving heat, hunger, and distance. It was about living under a standard that treated even small acts of disobedience as evidence of something deeper. Parents told their children the story in low voices at night, explaining why the day of rest could not be treated casually, why the commands they had been given were not suggestions. Generations later, readers would wrestle with the severity of what happened outside that camp, the man, the sticks, the stones, the community that watched and participated. In the moment, for the people who had walked out of Egypt and stood at Sinai, it was a stark lesson in the cost of belonging to a covenant that demanded loyalty down to the details of how they worked, rested, and lived each day in the desert. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.